Immediately thinking joust of peace. You know, when in the 13th century, they're scratching their heads wondering how do we make jousting a little bit safer, because it's really dangerous and we need to practice putting our spear through someone else's head, but it's really hard. How do we practice that without actually putting swords through lances through people's heads? Well, you make a multi-pronged thing that can't go through the side of the helmet. Then you can practice hitting each other in the eyes all day long, and it's mostly safe. But then, of course, the other danger in the joust that they're probably worrying about is that a sharp point can skip off and go anywhere, and your skilled opponent who's being careful can be guaranteed to hit you in the right place, but he can't manage if it goes into your groin or up into your throat or God knows where else. So the coronel also bites into the shield and stops that skating thing. So when I see a pronged head like that, which is reasonably dull and it's not like super spiky and nasty, I think that's a safety thing. That's someone trying to make a weapon safer. But of course, that's knights thinking about fighting other knights in full plate armor. If you smash someone in a padded jack with that on the battlefield, it's going to be trouble. Yeah, and so my counter argument. So to set the context of this, we were discussing: is this a poleaxe for fighting in tournaments? In other words, a slightly safer version of poleaxe, or is it just a poleaxe that you could use in any situation in war and a kind of duel to the death? Or something. It's that made me start thinking that. Right. I mean, the nature of these two weapons historically, if you look at the catalogs, has never been questioned. They've just said they're knightly axes and off they went. And that was it. But I looked at that, and this particular feature on this particular axe was what made me wonder, are we looking at a war versus tournament thing? I don't know if there's an answer. I don't know if there needs to be a distinction, because they often fought formal, cordial deeds of arms with sharp weapons because it's impressive. So, but we also know that there were clearly distinctions between tournament axes for fun and war axes for killing people. And absolutely there were other types of specialised tournament weapon. René d'Anjou's tournament book, for example, very clearly shows these wooden batons that are supposed to simulate maces, and the swords with a square point and this type of stuff. So my impression is that probably this sort of coronet was invented for lances, and then they realised it had other applications. I think probably someone looked at it and thought, that's really good for biting into breastplates and helmets, and it knocks people off their horses, which is what we want. So maybe we could apply this to some actual, war weapons, and then they went away and applied it to warhammers and poleaxes and stuff. I mean, my feeling is that it doesn't by itself indicate a tournament-friendly weapon, because you find it on Lucerne hammers and warhammers and other weapons that were definitely war weapons. But there are other things we could look at about the axe which we might question, would that indicate? So I know in the past you've mentioned about the edge of this one, and it's particularly... It's a different thing. You've got a straight edge, and you've got this much smaller, deeply curved edge. And this seems to have quite a lot of distal taper and what seems like a sharp edge and sharp points, and this doesn't seem to have quite as much of a distal taper, and the edge doesn't seem like it's ever been especially sharp. Now this is not razor sharp, this is not slash you open. It's not for shaving. No, but it's the splitting sharp. But so maybe this would do the job too, because you need the durability in warfare. You can't have the thing break off and chip as soon as you join battle. So obviously we have the great honour of being able to see this right up close like this, which I'm sure lots of you watching this would wish you could as well, and I would encourage you to come to the Wallace Collection and stare through the cabinets for many hours, as I did as a kid. But I have to say, I think this is kind of close to wood chopping axe thickness, and I think if you're going to be repeatedly hitting armour, do you need it to be sharp? It's predominantly a splitter rather than a cutter, I would say. And it is, it's still a wedge section. So I say at the back of the axe blade, it probably starts about 1 centimetre thick, something like that, and it does come down to about maybe 3 millimetres before it goes into a bevel. And anyone who says that medieval weapons don't have secondary bevels, that's not true, because a lot of them do. And there's one right here in front of me, and there's another one right there. They've both got secondary bevels. So Who said that? I never heard that.
Many years ago, so I won't say, but there was someone who used to say that you only got secondary bevels on replica swords, but it's not true. Of course, you do find them on Indian swords. Indian swords practically always have a secondary bevel. But anyway. But yeah, this definitely has a secondary bevel, and I think what I would describe this as a robust edge. So this is an edge where you want to split things, and certainly if you hit someone in the head with that, it's going to split their head in half with no problem at all. It's about 6 pounds, we established, so it's about 6 pounds weight, and of course, although it's got languettes, just be very careful here around the cable, so the languettes actually go all the way down to there, basically about halfway down the shaft, and they're fully enclosed for about the first quarter. So fully enclosed box, as Toby mentioned, all the way down to a quarter, and then the next quarter is just sort of strips on the side and the front and back. So it's a lot of weight concentrated on the hitting end or the axe end of the weapon.
But I would say that, I mean, having a curved edge, this would actually transfer more force on the plate, and this as
or anything else it was hitting. Yeah.
So okay, it's overbuilt and it's thicker, but it also, like, from a physics point of view, like this has a both flat, both the ends, so this would actually be like softer on armor. Well, this would be a little bit like more concentrated, and it would like crimple it more.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
so
it's going to crease.
Okay, it's a coronel.
Thinner plates, it's going to absolutely crunch them, isn't it?
Exactly. So it's a coronel, but it's also curved blade. So it's really, I mean, it's an open debate, I would say.
And if you've always got a choice about which side to hit someone with, and this is, to a certain extent, I have to say, I think that these weapons have a thing on either side to make them more balance better in the hand, because if you only had the weight on one side, they're always going to be swiveling slightly, and if you hit something like a breastplate, for example, with an axe blade, take a Dane axe and hit someone in a solid breastplate, as soon as you hit it, the shaft and the socket, the back end of the weapon, is going to want to fold in on itself, because obviously Dane axes are made for a completely different context to these. They're for cutting flesh, and they're very thin blades. Whereas if you're repeatedly hitting breastplates and helmets and pauldrons and things like this, you need something that when it hits, it doesn't lose energy by flipping over, and having weight at the back, like a pommel on a sword, will help that to some extent. But I would also think you've always got a choice when you hit someone. You think, okay, I'm going to hit him in the head really hard. Do I hit him with the axe blade, or do I hit him with the hammer? And I would say most of the time you'd probably elect to hit someone in the helmet with a hammer, because you know that the axe is not going to get through a hardened steel skull of a helmet, and I think that's more like to glance off. So if you hit an armet or a close helmet with that, it's going to slide off and you'll lose lots of the energy, whereas that, I think, is more like to bite in,
like more purchase,
and hurt the person's neck and this kind of stuff, or knock them sideways. Or the other thing to mention, of course, is also Dr. Capwell mentioned about the shafts, and it's always difficult to tell how original a shaft is. Therefore, it's always difficult to tell how long a specific weapon is. But the other thing is that very often they don't have anything on the back end. Interestingly, this one does, doesn't it? Do we think that that's an original knob?
It looks old.
It does look old.
It got some nice sort of cut decoration on it that looks a lot like what you see on armor of the period. It doesn't immediately look wrong or replaced or different than the rest of it. So there are not many of these around, and this has as good a chance of being a real one as anybody else, but it's kind of weird that it's got this big ball on the end.
I mean, we absolutely know for a fact a lot of the pole arms in this collection and in all collections have been shortened, haven't they? And you can absolutely see where they've either broken or sawn off the bottom end, and often the wood is much lighter at the end than the rest of the shaft. To fit them into collections and to put them on walls and make displays and stuff in the 19th century. We don't know about this one because it's got a cap on the end, which that's unusual, and that's great that it's got something on the end. But it's not a spike, is it? It's not a weapon. I mean, you could certainly hit someone, you could jab someone with that, but it's not going to penetrate anything.
I still wouldn't want to get that in my eye.
No. But in the armpit, it would be.
If you've got the choice, like in the various in the Copenhagen fact book, they've got spikes. You can see they've got spikes on the end there,
and some of them quite big. And and in Talhoffer's, they even show a version with other things at the back end, like a little hook and this kind of stuff as well, which for hooking behind someone's pulling or this kind of bits of their armor.
So as he was just playing devil's advocate earlier, as Augusto said, well, what if this is the tournament axe and that's the war? Then you're sort of ball on the end of the spike that you're going to be repeatedly stabbing with. And that stabbing is one of the biggest dangers, and the first thing you're going to say don't do if it's a combat of courtesy or whatever.
I mean, I'll pin my opinions to the wall. I absolutely think that both of these are fighting axes, because I think they're too pointy. And so when we were talking earlier, I mentioned about the deeds of Jacques de Leilang, and I'm sure some of you will have read those. They're online. Burgundian knight, famous for fighting with everything and everywhere, fought all over Europe, but particularly with Pollaxes. He was particularly famed with the poleaxe, and he had this one fight where it was specified they'd fight with sharp poleaxes. Well, you extrapolate from that, of course, you don't specify sharp poleaxes if there's no such thing as a blunt poleaxe. Right. So there must have been blunt poleaxes. Yeah. And we know they had training weapons. We know that they used sticks and blunt swords and wooden swords and all this kind of stuff, and whalebone or baleen swords. For poleaxes, we don't really know what the blunt ones would have looked like. Probably they would have looked just the same, but just blunted off. You mentioned about this one being quite dull. I mean, it could just be because it's old. And
banged up.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that this has actually been used quite a bit. I mean, it's interesting. So anybody who's seen this in a book, and certainly I grew up seeing this poleaxe and that poleaxe in books, you'll notice that I'll bring this close to the camera, actually, I haven't done this one. The back of the hammer just there, you can see it's like there's a point missing. And it's interesting because I think if you're hitting someone with the hammer end, you're naturally going to be striking at this angle, generally speaking, as you reach out to hit them. So very often the thing which is going to hit first is that bottom spike. So I think if any one of those spikes was going to get broken in use, rather than just falling over in a collection or whatever else, that's the point that's probably going to get blunt the quickest, that bottom one. So I think that actually might indicate that it has been smashed into helmets or breastplates or something.
Yeah, and if you start to look really closely, I bet you'd start to see more of the typical use marks that you would expect to see on these things.
Yeah.
But, we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned... Yeah, it does.
The edges on the corners.
Yeah, it's difficult to tell what's pitting and what's damaged, isn't it? Because it's obviously this has been very rusty at some point, which has eaten a bit into the steel, and then it's been cleaned. We were talking about the size of poleaxe heads as well, and you'll notice they're not very big. They're not like fantasy like axes with these giant blades, like in Conan or something. They're pretty small. I don't know what that is. I don't know, 6 inches. Yeah.
15 centimeters.
We have the metric here. We have a metric first.
The span of the average man.
Yeah, there we go. So it's half the size of my face, shall we say. And that's as big as it needs to be, because you've got to remember these are weapons that weigh 6 pounds thereabouts. I think one of these is lighter than the other. I think that one's lighter. This is a bit lighter. Yeah, because this has got bigger sort of languettes. So that's about 5.5 pounds. This is about 6 pounds, whatever that is, and say 2 kilograms.
3 kilos, 2.5 maybe.
No, brilliant. I need you on all my videos to do the metric. Yeah. And when you're swinging something of that weight, but importantly where most of the weight is at this end and it's on a long shaft, a long lever, you don't need a big axe head. You just want to translate a lot of energy into the thing you're hitting.
And speed.
Speed's
absolutely. More important than weight.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is big enough to get the job done. And when you might say, okay, something like a Dane axe has got a much bigger head, and yes it has, but they're actually very light because they're very thin, and again it's a different purpose, and it's for hitting predominantly unarmoured people, or at most they're going to have mail on. And so if you look at, for example, the Dane axes that survive in the Museum of London that were pulled out of the River Thames, most of them have got super thin blades, and then they actually get slightly thicker just behind the edge into almost like a diamond section edge. So they've got the mass only where they need it to reinforce that edge, and then the rest of it's made as light as possible. Really beautiful things, actually.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you very much for getting these out of the cabinets, because I've held this one before, but I've never held this one before, and I have to say, because I'm more of an early 15th century guy, this is like what you kind of see in those early. I can see Augusto nodding as well. It's exactly what you see in those kind of 1400, 1420 manuscripts. This could exactly be. It could have been the poleaxe in one of those manuscripts, couldn't it?
Fiore would approve.
Yeah, although interestingly, so that's, I guess, one final thing to finish on. These are specifically poleaxes, and the pole means head. I even read a thing that said that pole refers to the hammer, and that in some texts a poleaxe is for killing cattle, because you see in manuscripts cattle tied down to the ground and they hit them with a big, like a sledgehammer, and that was a poleaxe, and so actually it's a pole axe. But we do, of course, what we call pollaxes, or what Fiore called a adza. Sorry, Fiore with a Z rather than a C. And so his are this and a spike at the back. So he doesn't have an axe blade at all.
But you can still call that a pollaxe.
You can still call it a pollaxe. And interestingly, in Italian, the adza doesn't really necessarily imply an axe, does it? It's just.
I mean, you have mazza, which is mace, and ascia, which is axe. So it's like
a mace axe.
I wouldn't know, but
which could be like a pollaxe. So maybe that gives us some more clues about the English
like
pollaxe.
Maybe a hybrid word, but I'm not a linguist. So
yeah, that's very, very interesting. But just to say, really, that you do get different combinations. You sometimes get hammer with axe, or axe with spike, or hammer with spike. So any of these combinations, and there are similar and related weapons. For example, if we look in Froissart's Chronicles, the famous ones that are in lots of books, you see sometimes that have a hammer on both sides, don't you? Which are referred to by different names, and I don't think we're sure what they were actually originally called, but they all basically do the same thing. You've got a hitting thing here, hitting or piercing, hitting or piercing, hitting or piercing, piercing, piercing. But great weapons and very, very versatile. But just to mention also that the ones for lighter armour people are generally halberds and longer things. So these are more, not always, we do occasionally see lighter armour people with these, but they're usually associated with armoured fighting, aren't they? Because being shorter, you'd really need the armour so you're not getting your arms chopped off, basically. You need the added protection of using the shorter weapon with the full plate. But thank you very much, both of you, and we'll talk some more about some different things in a minute. Thank you.
All right.
Watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.